Let me ask you a basic question. What do you expect from a sermon? What would you most like to happen to you when you're listening to a sermon? Well, okay, now's your chance. What do you listen for in a sermon? Over the years I've asked that question, what do you expect from a sermon? I've asked that question to many laity, and here are some of the responses I've received. I like a sermon that helps me think about a biblical passage in a new and fresh way. I think a sermon ought to point out the ways that I've gone wrong and to suggest ways that I can get my life back on track. Or I want inspiration from a sermon, a feeling that I've been taken to a higher place, or I've been given a special feeling as a result of the sermon. The best sermons are those that give me something that's easy to remember, something I can take home with me. Well, now, while there is some truth and some appropriateness in all of these responses to the question, what do you expect from a sermon? Problem is, none of them align well with this Sunday's gospel. Jesus preaching at his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. A number of places Jesus is depicted as a preacher, and yet we got very few accounts of Jesus' actual preaching. Today is one of those few places. What do you think Jesus hoped to accomplish in this sermon? Luke says this was Jesus' first sermon. Very first time we see Jesus in action in the pulpit. Jesus goes back to his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. They give him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he reads those wonderful words of promise from that scroll. Now, if you were here last Sunday, you maybe heard those words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to preach the year of God's favor." Oh, those words have been fulfilled in your hearing. I tell you, there must have been a stirring in the congregation when Jesus read those stunning words. At long last, this long-awaited time of deliverance, foretold by the prophet Isaiah, is fulfilled. Now, today, undoubtedly, there was excitement in the congregation in Nazareth because, well, after all, who is more deserving of God's salvation, God's restoration, than suffering, oppressed, occupied Israel? At last, God is making good on God's promises. At last, God is coming for us. Good news! The preacher rolls up the scroll and, as was the custom, he sits down to preach. And that is when the trouble starts. They were having themselves a nice praise service. Jesus has them eating out of his hand. He's the hometown boy. He reads so well. And what wonderful words. And all might have gone well if Jesus had not preached. The preacher says, in effect, Isaiah says that God is coming to deliver the faithful. I say that day of the Lord's advent is now. Now, let's see, when was the last time God came to us? Well, it was during the time of the great prophet Elijah. There had to be many famished Jewish women when there was a great food shortage in the land. Isn't it interesting to find that God's prophet gave food to none of those hungry Jewish women, only to a Gentile, pagan woman? And you can almost feel the adoring hometown congregation become silent and sullen. The preacher continues. And come to think about it, there had to be lots of people suffering from various illnesses during the time of the prophet Elisha. But God's prophet healed none of them, only one, a Syrian army officer, was healed. I'm sure that Syrian army officer meant exactly the same thing then in Israel it means today. Luke says, when they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was filled with anger. They rose up, they ran him out of town. They led him to the crest of a hill on which their town had been built so they could throw him over the cliff. Wow. I mean, I've had some negative reactions to some of my sermons over the years, but never has anybody in the congregation tried to murder me because of my preaching. Why did the congregation in Nazareth become so upset? What turned their initial adoration into this murderous rage? Well, put yourself in their place. Here we are, God's people, gathered, the recipients of the promises of God to be with us, to deliver us. And yet for centuries, we've been the victims of the cruelty of other nations. Even now, the Roman Empire has its heel up against our necks. When is God going to make good on God's promises and come for us? After all, we are God's chosen people, God's beloved. The preacher says the day of deliverance is now. Well, we like the sound of that. But then the preacher continues, just working from our own sacred scriptures, to remind us of those occasions when God previously came among us. But in those times, God behaved in ways we didn't expect, in ways we don't appreciate. That day in Nazareth, the young hometown boy preacher reminded the faithful that during the days of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, God had worked the other side of the street. God had worked compassionate wonders, not for the chosen people, but for pagan outsiders. God had shown mercy to those who did not worship Israel's God. And who among us, the faithful, appreciates being reminded that, well, God has behaved in ways that are different from our expectations in the past and might well do so again? Well, so back to my opening question. What do you expect from a sermon? The congregation in Nazareth surely expected to be reminded that they were numbered among the chosen. Down through the ages, they had remained steadfast. They had worshiped God, even though God had provided them with little validation or reward for their fidelity. They had remained faithful to God, even when they had received little evidence that God was faithful to them. And now, in Jesus' sermon, they didn't enjoy being reminded that God had not lived up to their expectations before, and God might well do so again. That God was free and sovereign to show mercy on those whom God would show mercy, to love whomever God chose to love. Well, here's a stab at a response to that question. What do you expect out of a sermon? A response based on this morning's gospel. The purpose of a sermon, a Christian sermon, is to bring you closer to the true and living God. Sometimes in sermons you get helpful hints for better living, and sometimes you receive answers to your most pressing questions. But the main thing you get is the gift of being with a God who in Jesus Christ has chosen to be with you. And sometimes that closeness with God, it feels good. And sometimes it doesn't feel so good. But your feeling, bad or good, it isn't the main point. Sometimes what you hear sounds like good news. And frankly, sometimes it sounds like bad news. But the main thing is you have heard God's news. I got a rabbi friend who says Judaism is a rather simple religion, and it's based on just two profound articles of faith. One, there's only one God. Two, you're not it. Is that maybe close to what the folk at Nazareth experienced in Jesus' sermon? They arrived at the synagogue that day with their conceptions of God, all firmly fixed in place. But then the preacher, using nothing but Scripture, corrected, expanded, critiqued, enriched their idea of what God is, of who God is, and what God's up to. God's projects, God's intentions, God's concerns are bigger than this congregation. Maybe you could take that as a definition of an effective sermon. An effective sermon occurs when we're reminded that God is God and we're not. Every person in the synagogue in Nazareth that day began the day by reciting the great Jewish Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And Jesus, good Jew that he was, reminded the faithful that it's not like the Syrians have got their God, and then we have our patron God who runs errands just for us. There's only one God. Our God is determined to be their God as well. Our God is not our tamed pet. God is God, and we're not. I guess we're always in danger of attempting to cut the great, glorious God down to our size, to substitute other gods for the true and living God. That's what we ought to pray when we're about to hear a sermon that again reminds us that God is bigger than our meager concepts, our vain desires, our little projects. My predecessor at Duke University Chapel, James Cleland, was once asked what he thought about children's sermons, and he used a reply you may have heard before. A pastor had a children's sermon, and he called all the children down front, and he asked, "Boys and girls, what eats nuts and lives in a tree and has a bushy tail?" One little boy shouted out, "God?" Well, the congregation, of course, erupted with laughter. Children's sermon was just ruined. There was nothing to do but to have the closing prayer and then send the children back to their families. Well, after service, as the little boy was emerging from the church, the pastor pulled him aside. He said, "Look, kid, why'd you answer God when I asked you that question about squirrels?" The little boy, without missing a beat, he looked up at the pastor and he said, "Hey, you're a preacher, right? This is a church, right? You're supposed to be talking about God, not squirrels."